Hello, and welcome to Exploring Axon, a podcast where we discuss Axon Framework, Axon Server, and their ecosystem. I am your host and a software developer at Axonic, Sarah Torrey. In this episode, I spoke with Evelyn Van Kelle and Kenny Baas-Schwegler. Evelyn is a socio-technical specialist who works alongside Kenny in consulting tech companies in finding better ways when designing systems while working smoothly in teams and, when needed, resolving conflicts. We discussed the definition of the vicious cycle of unsustainable software development. We talked about the priorities when designing systems in DDD, RDD, and more. We also talked about how to recognize goals and values in teams, the process of slow and fast thinking, managing priorities, and much more. This was a really great conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. And let's have a listen. Good morning, Evelyn and Kenny. How are you today? Thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning, and thanks for having us. I mean, I'm really looking forward to this. Doing pretty well. So yeah.
Yeah, good morning. I'm really curious about some new insights every time I talk with Evelyn.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And
Yeah.
you two have been working together for a while, I understand. So there's a lot of wonderful knowledge and information amongst the two of you that I am so looking forward to talk about today. So Kenny and I had spoken in a few months ago, actually. So that was a really fun talk. But unfortunately, Evelyn, we didn't have the fortune to have you on that recording. But I'm so excited to have you today. And can you tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, where you're located at?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, now you can have Kenny twice, so that's also a win. So I'm located in the Netherlands, the southern part of the Netherlands, which is the best part for anyone who doesn't know that. And at this point, I'm a strategic software delivery consultant, which basically means that I help organizations to balance the whole socio-technical and cognitive aspect of their very complex environment. So I coach leadership teams and development teams to grow towards more autonomous and high performing teams with a shared sense of reality, which I think is very important.
Right.
And I'm a little bit weird, probably, or not that common in this IT world.
Right.
I have my main background, and the thing that I really love the most is my background in social sciences.
Right.
So I studied cognitive bias, heuristics, psychology, that sort of stuff, and I really think that helps
Yeah.
in the things that I'm doing, because there, of course, it's all about technology, but a lot of stuff is going, well, let's call it suboptimal,
Right.
because of all the social and cognitive aspects.
Of course.
So I think it's a really big plus, and that's also where Kenny and I found our common interest,
Right.
basically, because that match and that balance is really cool, and I think that we really empower each other in that sense. So that's really cool.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that I find talked about more and more in the field of technology these days, which is talking about the human side of things. So we're not just talking about, yes, the programming languages and this technology or that technology or, machine learning and all of that things. We are focusing more on the human aspect of it, which is something that I am personally very interested in. And as you know, I had a talk with Rebecca Wursbrock a few weeks ago, and she also has 2 degrees, one in computer science and another in psychology. And the combination of the two is just, it makes so much sense that I don't know why we didn't talk about this a long time ago. But I'm so glad that we are talking about it now and that we are focusing on it. So I appreciate you and everybody else who's making an effort into bringing this sort of more into the foreground of things. So that's really a huge plus, I'm sure, for Kenny as well, because he gets to really work with you closely, especially when consulting different companies and talking about some of the things that we talked about last time, like common language or conflicts and things like that. So today I would love to talk about some of the things that you have a lot of expertise in, and you've brought into the forefront of this conversation, which is one of the things that you mentioned in one of your talks was the concept of the vicious cycle of unsustainable software development. Can you talk about that a little bit and tell me what does that mean?
Yeah, that sounds pretty dangerous, right?
It does. It does.
Yeah, but you have to give it a name. It's such a name in order to make an impact, right? So that's also a bit of the psychology aspect there that I need to make an impact.
Absolutely.
Um, but now I'm giving away my secret, so that's maybe not the best thing to do. But anyway, no, yeah, the vicious cycle of unsustainable software development. Yeah, I mean, this is something that I saw happening in a lot of organizations when this was actually at my previous company. But in a lot of organizations, there's this thing going on that there is this fear to touch existing code. And what we then do is we come up with all sorts of workarounds and we start to hack and copy paste stuff. We come up with a lot of workarounds, and that makes the system grow in size and complexity. And what we then do is we throw in new developers in the mix, and we think that that will solve all of our problems. But what happens is they will, in turn, also have this fear to touch the existing code. So basically, this whole cycle is continuing.
Right.
And we see this as a solution, throwing more developers at the problem or something as a solution. But basically, this whole cycle is a communication problem, right? Because we very often like to jump to the technical side of things. But maybe that's not always the best thing to do, because there is an underlying problem here, why we are doing this, why we're in this cycle. And that has a lot to do with the social dynamics and how we are organized in teams. And that's why I really think it's super important to balance out these two or three aspects, basically.
Right.
And like you said in the beginning, it's good that now this social aspect is entering the mix more and more.
Yeah.
I do think we need to be careful that we are not completely going the other way,
Right.
that we are only focusing on the social side of things. But that's a risk. But I think the organizations that can balance that and that can break this cycle at a point that they are seeing, okay, we are doing a lot of workarounds, or we see our system grow in size and complexity. We observe that there is this fear of touching existing code.
Right.
I mean, those are all really strong signals that there is something going wrong underneath, right? That this is not just a technical problem, but there's something going on in the dynamics or the team structure or the organizational structure that you need to look at, because that is how you can solve the problem. So basically, one of the things that I said in my talks as well, first solve the problem and then write the code.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very, very strong, good advice that we need to do. But yeah, I mean, Kenny, you've seen this cycle working in your organizations and projects as well, right?
So the biggest problem I usually see is the things that all things are bad. So
Right.
I've done several workshops, and then we say, well, this system is 7 years old, and people immediately say, wow, that's a monolith, or that's a monolith.
Yeah.
Well, monolith isn't bad, actually.
Yeah.
It's a good pattern.
Yeah.
It's not an anti-pattern. But they think, oh, legacy is bad. But my first job, I had a legacy that was already there for 5 years, or maybe 10 years even, and it existed for 5 more years and was a critical business software.
Right.
And it worked.
Yeah.
And there was no bad thing about it. But that, if we already anchor that, then we're already going into the biases, right?
Exactly. And
we immediately think it's bad.
Right. And that's one of the things that when we talk about, especially when it comes to sort of like the DDD side of things, or maybe moving into microservices or event sourcing and things like that. And a lot of times there are these very sometimes opposing views. Some of the for instance, developers might think that, it's, as you mentioned, this system is so old and it has to be just uprooted from the beginning and then just started over again. And you have the other side of the coin where somebody would say, oh, but this is a legacy system and we shouldn't touch it because it's been working so far. But how do we kind of make that transition, and how do we kind of get over those biases or preconceptions is something that's really difficult, I find, in a lot of teams. And we have a lot of conversations sometimes with colleagues or acquaintances that are sort of coming into this field, especially the field of domain-driven design or responsibility-driven design and things like that. And they have this fear that, where do we even begin? Where do we even start, right? So I'm sure you've seen it a lot of times in your consulting as well. And that's one of the things that I think you talk about when you discuss values and goals. And what are those values? What kind of goals we're trying to achieve from that. So if you don't mind, yet kind of talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. And well, that was actually, I did some research on social success factors in agile software development at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, one of the most important predictor when it came to successful projects, and I can I can extend a lot about that, but I won't. But one of the best predictor for success was actually something called value congruence, and that means that all the values of the team or the organization are aligned. And values, well,
Mm-hmm.
they come in all different sorts and sizes. You have personal values and work values, but in teams where those work values aligned, they were better able to to create successful projects and to accomplish those in a better way. And that was a very eye-opening thing for me, because
Mm-hmm.
when I was studying this, I was like, okay, so this is a very, very social thing
Yeah.
that is predicting the success of these projects.
Right.
So the alignment in values is basically what leads in the end to that shared sense of reality, so that you are on the same page, that you have the same idea about the reality and the environment that you're working on, and the problems that you are solving and how you're solving them and the complexity. But it all starts with these values. So
Right.
basically, what I also do in organizations and projects and teams that I'm in is try to assess those values. Like, are we aligned in a way? Do we have the same values? Because if there's something off there, and of course not everything has to be perfectly aligned,
Mm-hmm.
but if there are very, very big differences, then that's a very strong indicator that there will be some struggles along the way as well.
Right. Right.
So basically the values also impact the goals, of course. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you have to take a look at these values, and it helps. That's maybe an interesting side note. It helps if the personal values are aligned in a way as well, but that just
Yes.
means that you probably like the other person's more. So that helps always, obviously.
Of course.
But it is worth it to take a look at these values. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So in a team that, for instance, you have somebody who is maybe having different ideas about what this project should be or where it should go, or your basic values of where this system should head to, how do you sort of resolve those conflicts? How do you kind of come back to their basic values? And in a case that maybe the two colleagues don't like each other, what do you do then?
Yeah, well, that's a problem. Well, you don't have to like everyone, but
Of course.
you don't really have to like everyone that you're working with.
Yeah, but of course, when you have those personal
Yeah,
issues, it's harder to kind of come down and resolve those basic
yeah,
values, right?
absolutely.
Yeah. So I think it has to do with the way we manage conflicts, right? Usually we see conflicts as something bad, but I think conflict is the status quo. Evelyn and I have a lot of conflicts. She just said Brabant is the best part,
Right.
the southern part of the Netherlands. I don't agree. We have a conflict. That's just a joke. But
Right.
for me, a conflict shouldn't have this bad
Mhm.
annotation. A conflict, same as failing, should be your opportunity to learn. Because if you have a conflict or a disagreement in an opinion, it's up to you as a person to then think,
Yes.
what is there to learn what I don't know yet about the other person? Because we have a conflict for a reason. That's because our mental models aren't aligning. So
Right.
that means I don't understand the other person yet, or I don't understand his reasons, or there's knowledge to be gained from this other person. So if we turn it around and say, oh, and this is really hard, I'm not also, yesterday I also had a conflict with my wife again, and it's so hard to
Right.
just listen at that
Yeah.
point, for me at least. But so it's hard, but changing that around and thinking, okay, I have a conflict and we don't agree on something. Okay,
Right.
what's there for me to learn from the other?
Mm-hmm.
And if we
Mm-hmm.
all get into that mode of trying to understand each other first in a dialogue instead of a discussion where your sole reason is to win.
It's so true, because I mean, and coming also back to your question about the values, I mean, it starts with these conflicts. I mean, you very often when you come into a team or an organization, you observe or you feel like, okay, something is off here or not, and you have an idea of, okay, there is some underlying conflict that's holding us back here. So
Sure.
in a lot of cases, the first thing that I do is just sit in a room together. And now, of course, it's a virtual room, but
Yeah.
just sit together and see if there is still stuff that needs to be resolved, or if there
Mhm.
are things that haven't been
Right.
said that really need to be said. And that's very uncomfortable in the beginning. I found that very uncomfortable in the beginning as well. As a facilitator, it's less uncomfortable, I can tell you that. But basically, that is what you need, and it helps if you have an external facilitator that's objective and that can just steer that conversation in a way, or just make it we like to call it meetings as campfires or conflicts as campfires, instead of just trying to convince the other party of you being right and the other person being an idiot. Just try to have that open conversation and see if there's something that you can, like Kenny said, that you can learn, or is there anything that we still need to resolve before we continue? Because as long as you're in that mode of I'm doing something right and this other person is wrong, then you will never understand the other person's values and
Right.
everything that comes after that. So basically, it is a very important
Yeah,
step
absolutely.
if you want to be
Right.
successful.
And I
Yeah.
think it's interesting that you mentioned now that, it's a virtual room basically, because we're in this situation that we're in right now. A lot of people are working from home and a lot of people are working remotely and have to have these sort of the next level, if you would, communication skills, because you're not in the room with that person anymore. In a way, it could be good. It could also be bad, because if you're having, for instance, if you're having conflict, you can basically turn off your camera or your microphone and just kind of like, curse it out or whatever, and then come back when you're calmer and have a calmer conversation, right? Whereas when you're in the same room, you kind of don't have that opportunity. You have to manage your I don't know, conflict, your feelings, your basic values basically in a different way. So it's interesting. I think I would be interested to come back and have another talk in a couple of years and see how our social communication and sort of dynamics are changing with the changing world. So
Yeah.
it's interesting
It's
to come back
completely
to it.
different.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So you do mention that when communicating with colleagues or team members and things like that, and kind of coming back to the core values and coming back to something that we can find a common uh, ground for everybody, that people can talk and things like that. But you also mentioned that we need to revisit and polish some of these changes and some of these maybe core values even. How often do you recommend that? Of course, it depends on the project, on the team, or anything like that. But what do you think the values of revisiting these perhaps conflicts or even resolutions bring into the team?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it depends. I'm a
Of course,
consultant.
I'm in software. Everything depends all the time. Yes.
No, but that's a fair point. Yeah, I do. It does happen quite often, but that usually happens after you really start to have those honest conversations. Let's say, because then it allows you to
Yeah.
overcome some of the biases that you're suffering from, and really.
Hmm.
Start seeing the other person's perspective and gaining more understanding, and then it's easier
Hmm.
to talk about those values and to have a real conversation about those values. Because, well, for a
Hmm.
very simple example, I was in a project not recently where we started to discuss something as simple as a definition of ready,
Hmm.
and those also count as values. I mean, everyone has different ideas on
Right.
definitions of ready. So this conversation was supposed to be a very simple conversation,
Yeah.
but it wasn't a very simple conversation.
Yeah.
And it turned out that there were a lot of values that were misaligned. And so basically, those simple things. I mean, values sound very broad and general and maybe complex, but
Hmm.
it's also in these simple things, like just the definition of done, the working agreements that we have as a team. Are they
Yeah.
aligned? And
Yeah.
if you notice that this is a very very difficult conversation, then that's a signal that there's
Right.
something not really aligned in a way, and
Yeah.
that you have to have a conversation about that. Yeah. So then I advise you, okay, let's take a look at these values.
Hmm.
Let's
Hmm.
do it in a way that we are not really influencing each other up front, because that's what we do and that's what our biases do for us.
Hmm.
So I do that with a lot of individual contributions. So
Right.
just first of all, put it on a sticky, and that
Hmm.
can be a virtual or a physical sticky, and just start to have a conversation
Yeah.
after those individual contributions. And and that really helps. Yeah.
And I'm glad that you brought up the point of sticky notes, because some of the things that we talk about when modeling a system, on when we're talking about beginning a new project, or maybe transitioning a legacy project into something that's a little bit more, in my field, for instance, DDD related, or events, you want to source your events, or something like that. And
Yeah.
then we start talking about, of course, event storming, which Kenny knows a lot about that, and please chip in. And I think that also talks a lot about values, because when you put in the result that you want to gain from a system, or when you want to change a system, the things that you put down on the sticky note, I think those are values as well. And Kenny, please jump in if I'm completely on the wrong track. But that's how I always value it. When you're modeling something, you're really basically talking about your basic values. You're really
Yeah.
bringing up those important things to you, basically. And then once you get everybody's point of view, then you can bring it down and come up with a system that might work for solving a business problem or solution.
There was an interesting discussion last time on a meetup
Hmm.
about event storming, where, well, there is an opportunity that people can pitch in, right?
Yeah.
Especially in the first chaotic phase. It doesn't mean, however, that everyone will do that. And going back to also, when do you change the values? There's another thing that me and Evelyn do, is watch patterns emerging in the groups. And there's this
Right.
thing called the resistance line,
Hmm.
and it might start, or it usually starts with sarcastic jokes. Not saying sarcastic jokes are bad,
Hmm.
and this is what usually always happening in groups, right?
Right.
When knowledge is suppressed,
Hmm.
so like opinions are suppressed, we start with some sarcastic jokes. And a sarcastic joke by itself isn't that
Harmful. Yeah.
problematic, right? But it isn't harmful. It's a normal way. There's, even in anthropology, as far as I know, there's this joking relationships
Hmm.
where, like, making jokes about your mother-in-law, right? That's healthy because there's a taboo not being spoken about. So
Right.
it's a ritual, actually.
Yeah.
So it's not really even bad. I'm not saying it's bad, but it's a way to look at if there are decision makers, or is there knowledge suppressed.
Hmm.
You can watch that group getting into that. And at some point, it stopped communication, or it's even going on strike, right?
Yeah.
You see it now with the whole corona pandemic.
Right.
People are going on strike.
Hmm.
And that's the opposite sound. And that's people resisting to the decisions being made.
Right.
So that's also happening with values. Sometimes people will say yes,
Hmm.
but actually they think no because it's not safe for them yet to.
Absolutely.
And an event storming might be a sort of pressure cooker for that.
Right.
So you sometimes really got to be careful with it
Sure.
and watch that system going. So never play on the person itself.
Hmm.
So never point fingers as a facilitator, at least.
Yeah.
Don't say, "Hey, Evelyn, why are you doing this?" No, that's unsafe.
Right.
Do it on a one-on-one.
Right.
And if you really want to do that, you want to have one-on-ones, because you get so much more information in that one-on-one setting.
Yeah.
And then do event storming. So make sure it's really, really, really safe in an event storming. And that's the hard part. But it can also teach you a lot. And Evelyn, we've been in that situation, right, where we did event storming, and they're like, "Whoa, what a social pain it is here."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
We need to
honestly,
solve
that's the
this.
main reason. That's the main reason why I love event storming sessions. I mean, this is just a perfect mixture of social, technical, cognitive aspects, and everything is flying around and everything is interacting with each other. And
Hmm.
the pressure cooker thing, I like that analogy, because that's honestly what's happening. And
Right.
for a lot of people that are first coming into such an event storming session, they will think like, "Whoa, what is happening here? What's going on?" But this is where all of these three aspects come together, and you can gain so much knowledge and observations and signals in these sessions. I mean, you can see
Hmm.
a lot about the social dynamics, the power structures, decision making, technical decisions. There's just everything going on in these sessions, and that's brilliant. That's really brilliant.
So now that I have to come back to this because this is our world at the moment. So now that everything is virtual, and you do event storming virtually as well, because now we have tools like Miro and such that you can basically collaborate with a lot of team members at the same time. How do you think those dynamics have changed or are changing?
Yeah, they are changing definitely, but they are changing in Well, there's two sides of it, I think. I mean, for me as a facilitator, and I think Kenny has that same thing because we are talking about this. Obviously, it's in when you're in a room, and especially me, I'm trained to observe nonverbal communication. I'm trained to do that, and that's really hard when you are in a Zoom session or in a Miro session or whatever, because you really have to look at the very small facial expressions or an eyebrow that's being raised or just like these sorts of stuff, and that's way easier to do when you're in a physical space
Yes.
together.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's harder to do that, and it's well, you need to pay more attention basically. But on the other hand, because you
Mm-hmm.
are in a Zoom session, at least what I'm observing is it seems that people are now paying more attention to what they're saying and how they're saying it, and there's also some
Mm-hmm.
messages in the tone of voice and that sort of stuff. So you're just looking at different stuff,
Yeah.
at different signals, which works. But I still prefer doing it in a physical room because it's better. But I think that the outcomes and the results that we are getting in these event storming sessions that we do remote are still good and valuable and yeah.
It's always interesting because I wonder if of course, that's also another case of it depends, right? But I wonder sometimes if somebody who's now put behind a screen versus, physically close to one another, I feel that for some individuals, this is becoming a little bit easier to say what's on their mind and sort of get rid of that invisible protective walls that they might have in front of them
Yeah.
when they're in front of somebody else physically. Um, and for some others, it might be very restrictive because
Yeah.
you don't have that personal connection to feed off of each other's body language and facial expressions and things like that. So it's it's interesting. So I always wonder how that's changing the dynamic. I use this word a lot today, but really it's the how is it changing in the dynamics of a team or when you're trying to start a new project or something like that. So
So there's this great book by J. Allen and Kristen
mhm.
called the Remote Facilitator Handbook. They've been already doing this for over 3 years, even longer, I think.
Yeah.
And it's a really
Yeah,
awesome
yeah.
handbook. And what we try to do during these sessions is really make sure people understand the tool. Because if they don't understand the
Mhm.
Miro, then you're practically locking them out from sharing their knowledge, right?
Yes, exactly.
So always we well, even in physical setting, we always start with a check-in where we just use the basic functionality and saying, well,
Mhm.
what's on your
Mhm.
mind, and try to let everyone at least speak. But that's also important.
Yeah.
Even just say your name. That's all for me. But
Yeah,
everyone should be able to get the opportunity to speak. And it's so
absolutely.
important. That's one of the questions. That's one of the things that it's so important that people are able to contribute. Because if that's already not
Mhm.
possible and people have problems with their Miro, and we've had this in several occasions, then you already lost
Yeah.
them, and that's already valuable
Right.
knowledge. And the second thing I would like to add there is we always do some sense making. So it's like, and
Mhm.
this is what I got from Rebecca and Ken Power, their workshop. Just have some
Yeah.
questions, anonymous questions, where people can just fill something in. And it's just to sense how the
Right.
group is doing. And these can
Mhm.
be a sort of like a way to look at how people are feeling about them, right? And that's
Right.
really the sense making. How is the group actually doing now? You need to do that a lot more than in a physical way, because in a physical way we can
Right.
feel and we can observe more. And now we just need to do that with tools and just see. And it's not perfect, but it's already helpful than not doing it at all. So small sense making
Exactly.
questions.
So, do you find that in your sessions, the notion of making sarcastic jokes and at the beginning of a session, for instance, do you see that still happening when you do this virtually? Is it getting less? Is it getting more? How is it for you
Yeah.
It really
specifically?
For
it's
me as
similar
well,
to the
I
physical
don't
set.
really sense a difference there. In a no, I mean, when you're in a physical space, there's also this first phase going on of just feeling the room and seeing,
Hmm.
do I
Hmm.
feel safe here, or do I like this or not, and how are the facilitators in the room, and that's also happening in the virtual session. So personally, I
Yeah.
don't really feel a difference in that. No.
Hmm. 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 Okay, that's just I was wondering. So, sort of shifting gears a little bit, you do talk a lot about also the ways that we think and learn. So, can we talk about that a little bit? Because you mentioned the notion of thinking fast versus thinking slowly, and about the different models or about different ways of coming into sort of that conclusion making or decision making, if you would. So like the obvious complex or complicated and chaotic ways that we go about. So yeah, I'd love
Yeah.
to hear more about that.
Yeah, well, sure. Well, this is also what I really really like, and I see all these. I mean, system one and system
Hmm.
two, thinking fast, thinking slow, really has a lot to do with cognitive bias, and this is where I got really triggered in my during my study, and yeah,
Yeah.
this is basically what what really, yeah, this is really what drives me also in the work that I do now. I mean, this is happening a lot, and it's impacting everything that we
Hmm.
do. So basically, in short, thinking fast and
Yeah.
slow, we have a system one and we have a system two in our brain. This is by the way not my idea. This is from Daniel Kahneman, which is a brilliant guy, and everyone should read the book. But we have a system one, which is for thinking fast, and we use that a lot of basically 90% of the time we're using this system. And it's
Right.
basically
Hmm.
our automatic pilot. I mean, this is the reason that we don't have to think about every single little decision that we are making in a day. I mean, if I would ask you, like, hey, how did you get here this morning, for example, you would have to think about every decision that you
Hmm.
have to make. So, how did you step out of your bed? How did you make your
Right.
coffee? How did you make your breakfast? How did you open the door? All these sorts of things is what your system one does for you, because it's based
Hmm.
on impulses, on your instinct. It's intuitive and it's fast, and it's really learning from your past experiences. So everything that you have done and that you
Hmm.
have repeatedly done is just saving it in a way, and it helps you make these decisions very fast, and in a very effective way most of the time.
Yeah.
And that means that you have some time left
Hmm.
to spend with your system two. And your system two is really for thinking slow, so very thoughtful and deliberate and rational.
Right.
And in some cases, you really, really need that, obviously. And system one
Hmm.
basically relies a lot on these cognitive biases. And you
Hmm.
need your system two to overcome these cognitive biases in a way. So, for example, what we also do in
Right.
our workshop, we talk about functional fixedness, for example. Well, that's a cognitive bias, and that really
Hmm.
stops us from thinking about things in new ways, because we are stuck in what we know, because we have done it a lot of times
Right.
in a certain way, and we are stuck in the way that we know that. So, for example, our fake domain in the trainings that we do has to do with the cinema. And we ask people to come up with
Hmm.
solutions for the whole COVID problem. Well, and basically, we think about the cinema
Right.
as being as it consists of rows and chairs, and it's this fixed thing that we have to deal with, and that's functional fixedness. So,
Right.
in order to overcome that, you deliberately have to activate your system too, in a way, to think outside of the box. So, what if we would remove all the chairs? What if we would work with floors?
Hmm.
Or what if we would completely change the whole thing? So, to overcome that functional fixedness, this cognitive bias, you really need to address that system too, and that's happening a lot. I mean, if you are looking at the general decision making in any team or organization, there's a lot of cognitive bias going on, and it really
Right.
helps if you are at least aware of that, and if you have someone, or if you are that person who can recognize that and act upon it. Because, well, like I said, in most cases you can perfectly rely on your system one and all these cognitive biases, but in some cases it
Right.
is very helpful to use your system two.
Yeah, so I was triggered last week by a discussion about also using several tools to discover, right? Like event storming, event modeling, example mapping, and some say, well, just
Right.
use maybe this one and we put several frames on it. And I'm more on the side of, and I'm not saying the one is bad or the other, but I'm more of
Hmm.
the side of you need to use many of these tools together, because in combination, because if you have event storming, that by itself is already the anchoring effect that we also talk about, right? Because I'm anchoring people to think in a timeline, while example mapping doesn't do that. So even using one tool, be aware that you're already anchoring your you're guiding your solution already in a certain way, thinking that it's a timeline. So I was just thinking and had this, well, rather epiphany this week that is by itself already a bias. So
Right.
yeah,
Every tool that we're
just
using.
using a
Yeah.
tool. So yeah, I'm a big fan of event storming, of course, but I usually switch tools quite fast, or maybe
Yeah.
not fast, but at some point, just to see, okay, how did this go? And interesting is what Evelyn just said. A good guiding heuristic, and this one comes from Rebecca, is model it wrong. Okay,
Yeah.
what could you do? What won't you do? How
Right.
wouldn't you want to implement this?
What's the worst
Absolutely.
idea ever?
We actually done that ourselves. Yeah, and actually out of that idea comes a new idea, which I was actually feasible in this case. So that was really interesting. I was like, no, I wouldn't do it like this. But actually,
Maybe I should.
well, yes, yeah,
Yeah.
that was interesting. Just to see that that bias like really inframed in my thinking.
And it could also be that
And it's fun. I mean,
absolutely, yeah, it's fun. And I think changing tools or using various tools is absolutely important because, as you mentioned, one tool can be used for a certain purpose, and you can, even though you're anchoring yourself, using other tools helps you to um, look at it from various points of views, or maybe change that bias along the way. It's very interesting. The one of the tools that I came across even before I started really digging into event storming was event modeling. And so for event modeling, you don't have really a timeline. You can really take your time and think about things. Of course, you have to go through that event storming process of it first to figure out what events you actually want to get out of the system. So that's interesting. But then you have more time to really go and make it a little bit more detailed, if you would, right? And changing between the patterns or between the models or between these even anchors or biases, I think, in my opinion, is really helpful, or in my case, has been helpful because it gets you to really look at it from a different view or an opposing view, even as you mentioned, Kenny. What if it doesn't
Especially
work?
opposing.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly. And
especially
that's so
yeah.
important.
Yeah, usually, and
Yeah.
we talk about this as well, Evelyn and I. It's there's two Dutch anthropologists that call that Harry. So it's the person with the odd view, and usually again there's a conflict. It's like, no, blame it on the person with the odd view. But what's there to learn again? Because that person is seeing it from a whole different view, and
Yeah.
maybe we should first listen to that
Yeah.
instead of judging.
And what you mentioned, I think it is also true because in other aspects of life as well, because a lot of times when you experiment with things or when you do something, or maybe even, I don't know, starting a new job or starting a new application or something like that, if it doesn't work out, a lot of times we go back and say, oh, I designed this application entirely wrong, or I designed the system completely wrong, and now I have to go back and start over. But we forget how important it is to gain the knowledge of, fantastic, it didn't work. I want to know why it didn't work, one. And also, it gives you an opportunity to know what you don't want in the end. Because we always know what we want, but oftentimes we don't know, or we forget what it is that we don't want. So we focus so much on, yes, I want to get this out of this application, or I want to get this out of this system. I want my system to do X, Y, and Z. But we don't necessarily thinking about what I don't want my system to do. So a lot of times, as we talked about failure a little bit ago, failure is really important because it kind of gives you another perspective of, oh, okay, this is how I got here. Maybe I need to change my pattern. Maybe I need to, change the heuristics. I don't know. Maybe it is something that I just completely overlooked in the process. So I think it's all very, very interesting, which brings me to the next portion, which I know you love talking about, Evelyn and Kenny as well, which is the heuristics and how do we make good decision, quote unquote good decision, right? Because I think, in my opinion, good is also one of those terms that it just depends, right? Also based on your time or your perspective of things at that time. So let's talk a little bit about that.
No, but that's very context dependent. Obviously, I mean, making good decisions. Yeah, that's hard.
Right.
but it's also, I mean, decision making. There's so much that impacts that. I mean, especially in a group. Yeah, the word dynamics is has come up a lot, but the socio-dynamics and, for example, the ranking that's impacting
Yeah.
who's talking and who makes a decision and who stays quiet. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, there's a lot going on there. So based on a lot of yeah, cognitive biases that are at play, you have to find a way to, yeah, to include at least some new insights and create new insights, right? And so there are basically, when you want to make a, well, that's my goal, my personal goal in a lot of situations, is to make the least biased decision that I can make. Because I know that biases in a lot of cases are influencing how I think and how I decide stuff.
Yes.
So what I do for myself and in organizations, okay, how can we make the least biased decisions? Which means that we
Mm-hmm.
have to include and create some new insights there as well. And like Kenny said, that the Harry, the
Right.
weird person in a room, we have to listen to that person, because this will give us new insights, and we have to include that. So it might be a minority insight,
Right.
but and especially if you
Yeah.
are a facilitator, you have to make sure that the minority insights are included as well.
Mm-hmm.
Model things wrong. We have to. A thing that I tell myself a lot of the times is that I have to drop my anchor, or make sure that any anchor
Right.
is dropped very consciously. Because once you drop something, once you mention something, everyone in the room or in the group or in the team or organization will adjust his or her view,
Mm-hmm.
opinion, perspective based on the anchor that I just dropped.
Right.
If I say, well, this will take us 2 weeks, that's an anchor, right? And no one will say, well, I think it will take us 2 years, because you don't do that anymore. So you have to be really, really aware of that anchor there. And I always tell myself that, um, but it's harder in your own personal life, obviously. But yeah, that's one thing that you can do.
You mentioned the word comfortable when we make decisions, and I really like that because it makes absolute perfect sense. You make your decisions based on your comfort level.
Yeah, but it's hard, right? I mean, it's especially if your decision impacts others as well, then it's really hard to be comfortable with that decision. But at the same time, you can only be really comfortable at a decision if you also looked at the other at alternatives and other views. And basically, what I've done quite a few times, because there's also this risk of overconfidence, right? When you think that you have a good idea and you will just go all in, because you have to make it work in your own head, so you just go all in, and you are very comfortable at that point. But what helps to check if you're really, really comfortable, so if you're not just relying on your expert intuition, but if you are really relying on your expertise, you can ask other people to try to make you feel
Yeah.
uncomfortable. And if you are still comfortable at the
Right.
end of that session, you can only do that with people you trust, by the way. If you are still comfortable at the end of that session, then you know it's not the decision is not that
Hmm.
biased, and that it might be a pretty decent solution or decision. Yeah.
So a second thing I would like to add is optionality, and this is something I also learned from Rebecca, but also from Liz Keong. And an example would be when my wife and me previously would live together. She rented out her house, so that she always has the option to go back. So if decisions, and this is what Rebecca says, you have two kinds of
Hmm.
decisions, right? Decisions that are revertible and
Right.
decisions that are not revertible.
Hmm.
If a decision is revertible, I'll just do it and I'll experiment. And don't go
Right.
all in,
Hmm.
what Evelyn just said, because that will just generate sunk cost fallacy, and then there's no way
Hmm.
back, right? The only thing
Hmm.
you could say is like, no, 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 that was a good decision. Well, it's not. So again, the ability to fail. But if
Right.
it's not revertible, then we need to maybe think about it and try to postpone as much as possible that decision. So how can we build in that optionality that we're still able to switch easily is something not working, and something we always say,
Hmm.
well, within domain-driven design,
Right.
just create several models for solving
Hmm.
a problem,
Hmm.
and
Right.
maybe just try to prototype them
Yeah.
all and see how it
Hmm.
feels. Are you comfortable with this one or not? It does both works, but which one are you more comfortable with? That's a bit of the social part. And
Right.
one thing I would like to add is if you do make that decision, make it explicit with the team and
Mhm.
get buy-in from the entire thing. And we use something called
Right.
Lumistic Democracy there. That means that there needs to be a majority for that vote. And if you reach a majority of the vote, ask
Right.
the other people in the group, what does it take for you to go along with this decision? And try to add that to that decision. Doesn't mean we're changing the decision, but we're adding things to the decision. There's a difference there. There's a difference between what we in the Netherlands are so well in poldering, meaning compromising. We're good at that. That's actually a name. We call it polderen in the Netherlands. It's
Right.
compromising. What that brings you is that everyone gets nothing. Everyone needs to
Right.
compromise. Nobody gets what they want. It's a either or. But what you want was take one decision and see, can we add
Right.
something to it? So we're going left. We're not going right. We're going left. What do you need? Well, maybe what I need for me if we're going left is, well, maybe I need a break every 15 minutes. Okay, how does the rest think? Is that okay for you as well? Yeah, let's do a break. And that's so important. And usually, and we totally understand that people sometimes need to make a decision
Right.
for the team, but at least ask, what do you need in order to go along with
To
this
make this
decision?
decision
People are
easier.
fine
Yeah.
with the decision.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what usually is forgotten. We're making a decision together. There's a majority. There's always the Hari who doesn't agree. Well, that's just the
Right.
case. We need to make this decision. We need to go somewhere, and we need to go all in. Maybe, well, not all in, but we need to go
Right.
there. What doesn't require you to get along? Because if you don't ask that question, that person will go into the resistance.
Exactly.
Sarcastic joke, stopped communication, or going into details to slow down that process of building. And I can tell you, you will never make those deadlines that way.
Yeah, it's really important to note that, because I remember it's 15 years ago when I was working at a company. A lot of the times you have, as you mentioned, the rankings are very important, and I'm happy to see that in a lot of the companies, those rankings are getting a little bit more in the gray zone, whereas it was so black and white in the past. Now I do understand a lot of times, still in a lot of industries, you do have that black and white, that it is just what it is. But what I like that I'm seeing more and more cases of, especially in the field of technology and software development, is that the voice is given to an entire team. So you have these really wonderful meetings, you have these communications, you have a lot of tools that you can use to not necessarily make everybody happy, because it's really, really difficult to make everybody happy. It's impossible. But at least to make things more manageable for people and bring people together to basically reach that common goal and solve that business problem that we're trying to solve. And I think what you both talked about today and what you do on a daily basis is extremely crucial, in my opinion, because yes, we all love to learn about more technologies and more, this new thing that just came out yesterday in like whatever field of software or technology you're looking at, and we are all so interested in nerding out on those, myself included. But I think a lot of what we sometimes miss is, again, the communication skills or the tools that we need to find a common ground. So I'm really, really excited that you both do this, and I'm excited that you bring your knowledge and your expertise into our talks and tell me more about it. And I really appreciate your time and efforts. I really, really love that. So just to conclude, is there anything that you'd like to add that I forgot to ask or mention?
I got one thing. You just reminded me of one thing what I wanted to
Yeah.
talk earlier, and it's really quickly. What usually
Yeah,
happens,
sure.
because you're talking about nerding over new technology, and I like that as well. And usually also the phrase over engineering happens. And that
Yes. Yeah.
usually
Yeah.
happens because we're not letting developers, software teams, engage with the user or customer or having a shared language, because there's already a lot
Right.
of problems solving user problems. But if they're
Mm-hmm,
being
mm-hmm.
denied from it, and I think, if that's my understanding, Kat Swettel talks about epistemic injustice or something,
Mm-hmm.
meaning if you don't let the software developers get access to your customer or the users making that,
Right.
then they never will know what they need to build. So where do
Mm-hmm.
they find their thrill? in new technology, in over-engineering,
Right.
in microservices, for instance. Not saying microservices is bad, but they tend to go to microservices because they don't fully understand the problem that the customers are facing. And they're being denied that by company cultures. And I think we should focus on that more, focus on how good a team, and I'm not saying it's bad to focus on technology, but there needs to be a balance also on the social aspect. Who are we building this for? And that's something you just reminded me.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's one of the aspects that I really love about working on open source product, because you really, really, truly get that feedback, which is super important. So a lot of the communication that we have with the community and things that we try to figure out, okay, so how can we, in our case, for instance, Axon Framework and Axon Server, the standard edition that's available on open source, how can we make this better and how can we improve it? And a lot of times we do have a lot of wonderful ideas and a lot of things that we want to add to improve this system. But sometimes we may not think of a certain thing. So when the client or somebody who's using it for their personal pleasure or what have you, and comes up and creates an issue, and we're like, oh, look at this wonderful thing that we can create now, or look at this extension we can be building. And so I'm so happy that you mentioned that. So that's one of the thrills I get from open source. I love that. But if the product is not open source, then you're absolutely right. There has to be that sort of communication and understanding what the customer is trying to get out of this product and how can you help it. And so involving the engineers in that. And sometimes us engineers don't really like to be involved. So it's like, I don't want to be in sales meetings or, customer meetings. But it is important at some level to have that understanding and to have that communication and build that relationship with the system and the end user. So absolutely.
And
I'm glad you mentioned that.
And that's the whole essence of domain-driven design. Understanding what the problem or the questions or the purpose of your customer is. That's
absolutely
it. That's the whole core purpose.
That's it. You're trying to solve that problem.
So we started with a circle and we're ending with a circle. Wow. Nice.
This is what I call a really good talk. I love it. Fantastic. I'll take it as a good thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Hopefully. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much both for joining me today. I really, really love talking to you both. And I can't wait to have more conversations in the future and sort of delving in a little bit deeper into some of these topics that we talked about today. I appreciate your time. I hope you enjoy your beautiful weather. I understand it's nice and warm now there after
it's spring.
Many weeks of really, really cold. Yeah. Spring is happening here in Hamburg too. So it's good times.
Yeah. We went from ice skating a week ago to being in a t-shirt in the garden.
Yes, same here. My kids couldn't believe how fast the snow melted. It was crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. Yeah, but thanks for having us.
Thanks for being here. I appreciate it. I hope you have a great day and talk to you soon.
All right, thank you.
All right, bye-bye. Thank you so much for listening to my talk with Evelyn and Kenny. I really hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Please join me next time as I discover more interesting topics surrounding DDD and Axon. Until then, have a great time and happy coding!